towering stone structures that spanned the crossing of the continents. That was exactly what Rian had expected to see rise majestically through the gloom once again. But a magnificent monument was not what awaited him and Adora on their return trip to the bridge. As they approached, the swirling mists dissipated just enough for them to peer out over the bleak landscape, revealing the shattered remains of an ancient stone highway that had been violently broken down and wrecked many years ago. Their massive white steed slowed to a halt, its hooves crunching softly on the cracked earth at the very edge of a precipice, just before the solid ground gave way to a terrifying drop. Ahead of them lay nothing but the fractured, hollow hulls of colossal stone platforms, suspended precariously over the void. Rian stared down at the jagged ruins, his heart sinking. Has this just happened? Did the recent battle do this? No, Adora replied, her voice dropping to a grim, hollow whisper. This is exactly what I was expecting to see when we marched across it the first time. She nudged her mount forward a few agonizing steps until the horse's front hooves reached the unstable, weathered edge of the stone ground. The bridge has been destroyed for an entire generation, Rian, she continued, her eyes sweeping over the massive gaps in the architecture. There is absolutely no way the Vanguard could have rebuilt it without the magic and structural knowledge of our people. Yet we marched across it as if it were a flawless highway. From what he could see through the thinning fog, a treacherous path to traverse the chasm did still exist. The fractured segments that remained of the ancient span appeared steady enough to support their weight, provided they galloped along the narrow ridges and used the horse's strength to jump the smaller, terrifying gaps. It would require absolute precision. They would need to take the crossing very slowly and steadily. We can do this, Rian stated firmly, squeezing his legs to urge the horse forward. I am not too sure about this, sir, Adora said, her hand instinctively tightening on his waist as she looked down into the abyss. The path across looks deeply uncertain, and if something further were to happen to you out there. I told you not to call me that, Rian interjected gently, his voice strained. Not yet, anyway. He pushed the horse past the threshold, guiding the animal slowly over the cracked stone sections of the bridge that looked the most stable. They moved forward in a tense, rhythmic, slow pace, with Rian navigating the path ahead to the best of his ability. As they ventured deeper into the crossing, he felt a chilling, eerie quiet settle over them. A heavy, suffocating silence that felt entirely different from their first journey. There were no sounds here, not the faint call of a skyward bird, nor the comforting roar of the rushing waters below. Even the warhorse beneath them was strangely, unnaturally quiet, its ears pinned back as it stepped with a nervous, trembling caution. One step at a time. Easy now, Rian whispered softly, leaning forward to stroke the horse's muscular neck. A few times they were forced to bring the animal to a complete halt to adjust their positioning. The horse naturally wanted to move in a straight line, but the fractured bridge demanded they twist and turn sharply where the ancient stone sections had completely collapsed into the void. Adora reached down to the leather waterskin hanging at the horse's side, pulling the stopper to take a long sip. Instantly she let out a sharp, choking cough, spitting the liquid onto the gray stone. She held the waterskin out in front of her face, observing the dark leather with profound suspicion. Even the water tastes completely strange now. Bitter and stagnant, she muttered, hastily fastening the stopper and securing it back onto the saddle rigging. How did we cross this bridge before? Rian questioned aloud, his eyes tracking a jagged fissure in the floor that revealed the ink-black, entirely still waters sleeping hundreds of feet below. In its current state, no army, especially one composed of hundreds of heavy infantry and horses, could have ridden across this without plunging into the dark. I have my dark suspicions, Adora replied, her green eyes scanning the horizon. But hopefully, we'll get the concrete answers you seek once we finally get back to whatever it is that lies ahead of us. Not likely, Rian suddenly snapped back. He didn't know where the sudden, volatile burst of frustration had come from, but it flared in his chest like wildfire. He felt Adora's head snap toward him in surprise at his sudden hostility. And what is that supposed to mean? She responded, her own tone sharpening in kind. Rian let out a long, weary sigh, the anger evaporating as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his shoulders slumping. "It's just, I've been desperately looking for answers ever since I woke up on that ridge. Everyone I've come across tells me one conflicting story or another, treating me like a pawn." Rian turned his head slightly to look out over the broken edge of the parapet. Why should the destination ahead be any different? "Because you've got me with you this time," Adora answered, her voice softening with a fierce, protective warmth. "I'll be able to help you sieve through the false information and the illusions. Plus, you yourself are beginning to remember Rian. You are finally beginning to believe who you are." Rian turned back to face the path ahead. "Yeah, I guess you're right." As he spoke, he realized his hand had subconsciously drifted to the hilt of his silver sword, his fingers tightly tracing the familiar leather wrap of the handle. Adora saw the subtle gesture from behind him and smiled quietly to herself. They continued their tedious trek for what felt like the better part of an hour, a reality that struck both of them as deeply bizarre. They both distinctly recalled their initial journey over the bridge taking at least half that time. Of course, they were currently forced to slow their pace to avoid the crumbling rubble and navigate the missing segments of the highway, but the underlying geography of the path was more or less a straight line. Rian could feel Adora shifting around uncomfortably on the saddle behind him, her breathing growing slightly shallow. "Everything okay back there?" Rian asked over his shoulder. "Could we please stop for a brief moment?" she requested, a rare note of fatigue in her voice. "Horse riding is historically not my favorite pastime." Rian nodded understandingly, pulling on the reins. They both climbed down from the massive steed, their boots hitting the cold stone ground with a dull thud. They sat down together near the center of the span, resting their backs against a fallen pillar as they peered intently toward the mist-shrouded north. Adora let out a long, relieved breath, relaxing her posture as she stretched her slender legs out across the stone. "That's significantly better," she sighed. "So, an elite elven warrior doesn't like horse riding?" he asked, a faint smile touching his lips as he tried to distract himself from the grief. "Not in the slightest, especially not for long, agonizing periods of time," she replied, turning her head to face him. "And if my memory serves me correctly, you were never a major fan of them either." "Me?" he replied, entirely confused by her words. Adora nodded, a soft, knowing smile illuminating her features. "Rian, our people live on top of a massive, jagged mountain. There are barely any roads up there to begin with. Why on earth would we need 1,000 horses?" She began to laugh softly, the musical sound echoing off the stone as if she were picturing her beautiful mountain home suddenly overrun by an army of clattering hooves. Rian shook his head, turning to pet the leg of his horse. The animal was currently content, nibbling on a few of the dried fruits Rian had gently tossed onto the ground. "Nah, I think you're just lying to me to make me feel better. I mean, look at this handsome fellow," Rian replied jokingly. He leaned his head fully against the horse's powerful foreleg, stroking the white fur more firmly. "That's perfectly fine, then," Adora countered with a smirk, trying and failing to conceal her amusement. "You and your handsome fellow can go home right now, and I'll just take on whatever dark threat lies ahead by myself, as usual." Home. The simple word struck Rian's heart with a tender, profound weight. Hearing her say it so casually made it real, and for the first time he found himself genuinely believing that a home existed out there waiting for him. "I bet it's going to be a massive horse that finally cures your amnesia," she added mischievously, catching Rian right as he was purposefully forcing a laugh down. Suddenly, a violent jolt shot through his mind. It wasn't a thought or a guess. It was a fragment of a real, vibrant memory. He saw a young elven girl, her features remarkably like Adora's, screaming at a stubborn horse that refused to move an inch from a mountain stream. He saw himself, younger and reckless, losing his balance and falling entirely off the saddle into the mud. He heard a chorus of bright, unbridled laughter. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the fragment vanished back into the dark. But the warm, comforting feeling it left behind lingered in his chest. "What is it?" Adora asked, her sharp eyes noticing the sudden, distant look of awe on his face. "What did you see?" "Oh, it's nothing," he replied softly, clearing his throat. "It's just, I feel like I've heard that exact joke somewhere before. Adora's smile widened, a tender look crossing her face as she lowered her eyes to the stones. Once they had rested their limbs for a few minutes, they decided to continue the crossing, mounting the steed once more and pushing the animal to a faster gallop wherever the terrain permitted. Up ahead, the mists that lingered over the northern shoreline began to rise, swirling higher into the sky than they had previously, and the crumbling crowns of ancient stone structures began to peek out above the fog. "We are nearly across the threshold," Adora called out over the wind, her posture straightening as the horse raced toward the end of the span. Crunch! A sudden, violent sound erupted from beneath the hooves, followed instantly by the deep, terrifying groan of shifting stone grinding against ancient iron supports. The entire bridge shuddered violently beneath them. A rapid, low-frequency vibration rippled through the architecture, traveling up the horse's legs. Rian pulled hard on the reins, bringing the horse to an abrupt halt as they frantically surveyed their immediate surroundings. "Wait, do you hear that?" Adora whispered sharply, throwing her hand up to signal absolute silence. The ominous groaning sound grew gradually louder, vibrating through the soles of their boots, before it stopped altogether, leaving a dead, breathless silence. "That was incredibly strange," she muttered. Without a single moment of warning, Adora and the stone beneath her vanished entirely from sight. Rian swung his head around just in time to see the entire section of the bridge she had been standing on fracture in two, collapsing into the abyss with a deafening roar. "Adora!" Rian screamed, his heart leaping into his throat as he threw himself wildly off the saddle. The collapsing masonry emitted a massive, choking cloud of gray dust that instantly obscured the entire drop. A second later, a few heavy, distant splashes echoed from the waters far below. Rian's mind immediately assumed the absolute worst, a wave of cold panic paralyzing his chest. "I'm down! Rian, I'm down here!" The strained coughing sound of her voice shattered the terrifying lump in his throat. Rian darted forward through the dust, falling to his stomach at the jagged edge of the break. There she was. Adora was hanging on for dear life, her fingers wrapped tightly around a rusted steel reinforcement pipe that jutted out from the broken masonry where the stone had sheared away. There was absolutely no sign of her mount. The horse had been taken by the fall. Rian scrambled forward, lowering his torso over the precipice as far as he safely could, stretching his arm out desperately into the void. Through the settling dust, he noticed a fresh, angry gash cutting across her left shoulder, weeping vibrant red blood against her skin. Adora gritted her teeth against the pain, violently throwing her free hand upward until her fingers locked onto his wrist in a vice-like grip. With a roar of exertion, Rian hoisted her upward with all his strength, pulling her safely over the lip of the fractured stone. Together, they scrambled back several paces into the center of the stable highway, collapsing onto their backs as they gasped for air. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Their breathing was ragged and heavy in the quiet of the wastes. Rian stared blankly up at the uniform gray sky, while Adora lay perfectly still beside him, her uninjured arm draped heavily over her eyes. For a long, profound moment, neither of them acknowledged just how close she had come to plunging into the dead waters. "Your horse," Rian finally broke the silence, his voice soft and laced with sorrow. Adora sat up abruptly, dusting the white masonry powder from her clothes. She looked out over the empty gap, then turned back to Rian, a wry smile forcing its way through her shaken expression. "He was an incredibly handsome fellow, wasn't he?" she replied dryly. Rian shook his head, a sudden bubble of hysterical relief escaping his chest as he let himself laugh. "I'm pretty sure your he was actually a she," he replied, turning his head to face her. She let out a soft grunt at the jest and pushed herself back to her feet, offering Rian a hand to help him stand. Once they were both upright, Rian immediately stepped closer to examine the weeping cut on her shoulder. "It's not too deep, thankfully," he noted, his practical instincts kicking in. "Here, let me bandage it up before it gets infected." "You really don't have to do that," she snapped back, her pride flaring. "I'm entirely certain I will live." Rian didn't offer a verbal argument. Instead, he simply reached down and tore a thick, clean strip of cloth from the sleeve of his tunic, where it extended past his iron arm gauntlets. Snatching the waterskin from the remaining horse, he soaked the fabric through, thoroughly wringing it out before stepping into her personal space. He worked gently, wrapping the damp cloth under her armpit and securing it tightly over her wounded shoulder. Adora rotated her arm in a cautious circle, ensuring the makeshift bandage felt secure and comfortable against her skin. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with genuine gratitude. It was only then, as the frantic adrenaline of the rescue finally began to fade, that Rian noticed a subtle shift in the environment. As they spoke, thick plumes of white vapor danced in the air before them. He could suddenly see their breaths. He didn't feel uncomfortably cold just yet, but the air had taken on a crisp, biting edge that hadn't been present on the southern shore. He chose not to bring it up to Adora, however. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, and knew she was still shaken by her brush with death. With only one mount remaining, Adora climbed onto the back of the white steed, sitting securely behind Rian as they carefully navigated the final stretch of the broken span. Suddenly, something caught her eye through the mist, and she pointed a slender finger forward over his shoulder. "Look! Up ahead! Look at the shoreline!" she exclaimed. Rian lifted his gaze to where she was pointing. The fractured ground of the bridge was finally beginning to rise, sloping upward as the end of the crossing loomed into view. Here, the mist was no longer spread thin and wide. It hung in dense, stagnant banks. But as the warhorse crossed over the bridge's final threshold and stepped onto solid land, the animal stopped dead in its tracks, letting out a sharp, frightened whinny. Rian and Adora froze. The vibrant, lush green terrain they had both witnessed when they first arrived with the vanguard was completely gone. In its place lay a horrific, desolate wasteland, populated entirely by the withered, lifeless, and ash-gray husks of what used to be towering trees and dense vegetation. "How is this even possible?" Rian whispered, his voice trembling. He wasn't even sure if Adora would possess the answer to the nightmare before them. "I fear this is what the land always looked like, Rian," she replied grimly, her grip tightening around his waist. "Some powerful, unseen magic was warping our minds, making it seem like a paradise." Their horse began to whinny softly again, shifting its weight nervously as a sudden, unnatural cold began to fall upon them. Even the sky above had changed. Where there had once been parted clouds and the faint, warm colors of a fading blue twilight, there was now only a uniform, oppressive blanket of leaden gray, a dark pall that had absolutely nothing to do with the scattered mists. "This cannot be the natural weather of this world, surely," Adora stated, an icy chill running straight down her spine. Rian's eyes scanned the dead hills until a specific shape caught his attention. He suddenly pulled back on the leather reins. "There!" he said, pointing a gauntleted hand toward a nearby rise. Adora followed his gaze. Perched upon a barren ridge stood a sight that was hauntingly familiar to Rian. This was the exact coordinates where Varric and his vanguard had set up their military camp for the night. But the reality of the sight was entirely unrecognizable. There was not a single canvas tent or ornate pavilion to be seen. Instead, the dark earth was marred by deep, jagged trench marks, as if something massive had been violently dug into the area long ago. A few broken, splintered pieces of dried wood stuck out of the frozen ground in random locations like decaying teeth. Atop one of these jagged poles hung what must have been a magnificent banner. Now it was nothing more than a dead, rotting shroud, flapping limply in the freezing wind as it clung to its rusted perch. "Is this the place?" Adora asked, her voice tight. "Yes, I believe so," Rian interjected, his mind reeling. He urged the horse forward, riding slowly toward the ruined banner. Worn away by the biting cold and the cruel passage of time, the grand emblem of Nostrador had all but faded into oblivion. Rian reached out from his saddle, grasping the tattered edges of the fabric and rubbing the material between his fingers. The moment his skin touched the cloth, the section he held disintegrated completely, falling away into a handful of fine gray ashes that scattered into the wind. "We were standing right here not a few hours ago," Rian muttered to himself, staring at his empty palm. "I don't understand how we could have been made so utterly blind to what clearly is the ancient truth of this place." Adora slid gracefully off the back of the horse, her boots crunching on the frosted grass as she walked toward a dark shape that had caught her eye further up the trail. A massive pile of rubble sat just north of their position. As she drew closer to it, Rian trotted alongside her on the steed, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "What is that?" he asked curiously. Adora placed her hand upon what was now clearly revealed to be a shattered pile of roughly carved rotting wood interwoven with rusted strips of iron. Halfway buried beneath the debris lay the skeletal shape of a massive wooden wheel. "This is one of the prison caravans," she exclaimed, her voice laced with sudden horror. "The very ones that carried my kin and me from the mountains." The transport looked just as desolate, aged, and decayed as the rest of the dead forests they had traveled through. A profound, suffocating confusion settled over them, layered with a sudden, spiking dread. Absolutely nothing about this journey had been natural. Adora reached deep into the hollow cavity of what used to be the inside of the caravan. When she pulled her hand back out, she was holding a small, familiar object. She held it up between herself and Rian, staring at it in total disbelief. "Wait, isn't that—" Rian began to say, his breath hitching. "Your water skin," Adora finished for him, her voice trembling. "The exact one you kindly gave me through the iron bars of my cage." Rian's hand flew to his hip, reaching frantically for the leather water skin that was supposed to be secured to the side of his saddle. His fingers wrapped around it. It was still hanging there, full of stagnant water. A violent shiver rippled through his entire body. He looked ahead at the desolate road. "I think we need to leave this place, right now," he said, his voice tight with panic, as he offered her a hand to climb back onto the horse. He immediately guided the steed back onto the trail, backtracking the exact path Varric had led him on previously. The general layout of the rolling hills and roads was thankfully identical, but the highway itself was barely visible now, buried beneath a thick layer of white frost that had settled over the dead grass and frozen soil. "Adora," Rian spoke into the biting wind. "Yes? Have you ever seen an illusion of this scale before? Anything like this?" There was a short, agonizing silence from behind him. "No," she muttered back to him quietly, her voice sounding small. For the very first time since he had met her, Rian could feel genuine, unadulterated fear radiating from the elven warrior. He could tell she was trying her absolute best to disguise it behind her usual stoic mask, but after nearly falling to her death on the collapsing bridge, the confident disguise had begun to completely slip. It didn't take them long to decide to abandon the haunted campsite and continue traveling north as fast as the horse could manage. Rian spurred the white steed into a full gallop, attempting to shorten the distance between the wasteland and their final destination. They sat in total silence for the majority of the ride, both of them staring aimlessly at the passing ruins of dead foliage and skeletal structures alike. Every now and again, massive stone structures would materialize from the distant fog. As they galloped past them, they realized these were long-forgotten, entirely empty guard towers monuments belonging to either the ancient ancestors of the men of Nostrador or another long-forgotten race entirely. Finally, peering out over the crest of the dead, rolling hills, the jagged silhouette of the city bled into view through the gray twilight. Its massive stone walls gleamed like polished bone in the sickly pale light from above. No longer choked by lush green trees and dense shrubbery, the city was now revealed to be ringed by a cruel, towering crown of black-veined ice pikes. It looked as though some colossal, buried horror had violently ruptured the earth from beneath the foundations, thrusting the city upward into the freezing air and leaving a jagged ring of frozen teeth to warn away the living. They dismounted on a rocky overlook, a position far enough from the city's massive iron gates that any unwanted eyes from the battlements could not spy them, but close enough that they could make out every terrifying detail of the architecture. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this, Rian?" Adora asked, her green eyes fixed on his profile. Rian stared intently ahead at the bleak fortress. The place he had once felt with absolute certainty was his home. "I have to," he replied, his voice hardening. "I need to find Zarek. I need to see if the old man is still inside those walls, if he was even real in the first place." Adora looked at him, her brow furrowing with deep concern. "Zarek? The old scholar? Why him?" "He was the very first person I met after waking up with amnesia," Rian explained, his fingers tightening around his sword hilt. "He helped me. He guided me through the halls and helped me find my feet when I was entirely lost." He could see that Adora was questioning everything he was saying in her mind, her expression laced with pity, as if she already knew that what he was looking for was bound to turn out to be another cruel fabrication. "Rian, I don't want you to be utterly heartbroken if you can't find him down there, or if you find out he is not true." Adora turned her gaze back to the bone-white walls of the city. "I mean, look at this place. Surely you can see the reality now. There is a profound falseness about it. Some ancient, unseen force is actively manipulating us and everything around it." Rian thought deeply on her words as the cold wind whipped against his face. This was perhaps the one singular thing that he felt was most true out of everything he had heard since his awakening. Manipulation. That was exactly what everyone around him had been doing to him from the very beginning. Varric, Zarek, the soldiers, even Adora, to some degree, by withholding his true title. This was precisely the reason he needed to go back inside. He needed to uncover the truth once and for all, and if it ultimately cost him his life to break the illusion, then so be it. They turned to face each other, sharing a silent, determined nod. Together, they began walking down the frozen slope, their boots cutting through the frost as they marched toward the dark entrance of the city.